There's something surreal about moments like these. Standing in the middle of a room full of people, all of them admiring you, envying you, and you're there playing the part perfectly. I could feel the weight of their gazes, their admiration for what they saw. And why wouldn't they? Amy and I were the couple. She was effortlessly beautiful, and I had to admit I wasn't so bad myself. We complemented each other like pieces of a well-designed puzzle. But tonight something was off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. Amy was smiling, laughing at jokes she normally wouldn't find amusing, her hand lightly touching my arm from time to time, just enough to keep up appearances. But I noticed the shift, her eyes darting away from mine too quickly, the slight stiffness in her shoulders. It was subtle, but to someone who knew her as well as I did, it was as glaring as a neon sign. The room buzzed around us, champagne glasses clinking, soft jazz playing in the background, but all of that felt like static noise compared to the feeling gnawing at my gut. I tried to ignore it at first, forcing myself to believe that maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just imagining things. But then, as I turned to speak with a colleague, I caught it. A fleeting look that passed between her and a man across the room. I didn't recognize him at first, but that look, it was enough. A look of shared understanding. A connection. My stomach tightened. I could feel my pulse in my throat. But I didn't say anything. Not yet. I had learned long ago that emotions were best controlled, kept under wraps until you had enough information. So I smiled, played along, and waited. Later in the evening, I excused myself to get some air, stepping outside onto the terrace. The cool night air did little to ease the tension building inside me. I stood there, gripping the balcony railing, trying to push the doubt out of my head, trying to tell myself that I was overthinking. I loved her. We were perfect together, weren't we? And then I heard it. Amy's voice, just around the corner, barely above a whisper. She was talking to a friend of hers, someone I barely knew. I should have walked away. I should have respected her privacy. But something in her tone stopped me. There was hesitation, guilt. I stepped closer, staying in the shadows, my breath held. I just don't know how much longer I can do this, Amy said, her voice strained. Her friend mumbled something in response, too soft for me to catch. Amy sighed, and then, the words that shattered the last of my illusions fell from her lips. I'm leaving him. For Mark. The world stopped. Mark. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. The perfect life, the admiration, the love we shared, it was all a lie. I stayed frozen in place for what felt like an eternity. My mind couldn't fully process what I had just heard. Mark. The name echoed in my head, bouncing around like a loose bullet. Amy, the woman I had spent years building a life with, was planning to leave me for another man. And not just any man. Mark, someone I barely knew, someone she had been seeing behind my back without a single hint or warning. A strange numbness washed over me, dulling the sharp pain of betrayal. It felt like everything was happening to someone else, like I was watching it unfold from the outside. But then the anger hit, hot and unrelenting, burning through the numbness like wildfire. How long had this been going on? How could she lie to my face for so long, pretending to love me, pretending that we had a future? I wanted to confront her right there on that terrace, to shout, to demand answers. But something held me back. Not fear, not confusion. Something colder, more calculated. The part of me that had always been good at reading people, understanding them, knew that an immediate confrontation wouldn't change anything. If I barged in, if I demanded answers now, what would it solve? She'd deny it, lie again, twist the situation until I was the one left questioning myself. No, I couldn't give her that power. Not yet. I walked back inside, blending seamlessly into the crowd, masking the storm brewing inside me. It was surreal how easily I slipped into my role, smiling and nodding at people who came up to greet me. If anyone noticed anything different about me, they didn't show it. On the surface, I was still Christian, the charming, successful man with a beautiful girlfriend by his side. But underneath, the cracks were spreading, the foundation of my life crumbling. Amy returned to me a few minutes later, as if nothing had changed. She smiled up at me, that same smile that once made my heart skip a beat, and it took everything in me not to recoil. Every word she spoke felt rehearsed, fake. It was like looking at a stranger. By the time we left the party, I had already made my decision. There would be no confrontation, no angry outbursts, no desperate pleas for an explanation. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, I would take control. I would make my move. She thought she had outplayed me, that I'd crumble and walk away quietly. But she had no idea what I was capable of. Amy had made her choice. Now it was my turn. The days after the party were a blur of quiet observation. Amy went about her usual routines, but I could tell she had already moved on emotionally. She smiled less at me, spent more time on her phone, and her late nights at work grew more frequent. But rather than confront her, I played along. I kept up the illusion that I was still the same Christian, still loving, still the man who had her back no matter what. All the while, I was calculating my next steps. I began to distance myself deliberately. It was subtle at first, a suggestion that we both needed space, a few nights apart here and there. She accepted it too easily, which only confirmed what I already knew. She was ready to leave. Amy thought I was giving her space to figure things out. In reality, I was taking control of the situation, laying the groundwork for my plan. She assumed I was the one falling apart when, in fact, I was weaving myself back into her life in ways she couldn't see. I found out where Mark worked, what circles he moved in, who his friends were. He wasn't hard to track, a flashy businessman who liked to flaunt his wealth and charm. Men like Mark are predictable. They thrive on attention, feed off admiration. And most importantly, they crave validation from the women in their lives. I began to frequent the same events they attended. It was almost too easy. I was still well liked among our mutual friends, so no one questioned my presence. Amy and Mark didn't see me as a threat. I played my role perfectly, casual, friendly, even offering polite words of support when the opportunity presented itself. And so I watched. I learned. Every little interaction between them became data I could use. Mark's ego, Amy's doubt. I could see the small cracks forming in their relationship already. It was only a matter of time before I'd widen them into a chasm. Mark thought he had won. Amy thought she had moved on. But they had no idea that I was the one pulling the strings. Mark was the easiest to manipulate. His confidence made him vulnerable, the way he carried himself as if he were invincible. Men like Mark thrive on control, on being the center of attention, and all it took was the right push to make him start doubting everything around him, especially Amy. But the beauty of it was that he never saw it coming. It started with small comments. I made sure they were harmless enough on the surface, but just sharp enough to plant the seed of suspicion. The first time I ran into him at a business event, I acted casual, as if I had no idea what had happened between him and Amy. We exchanged pleasantries, and as the conversation drifted toward relationships, I asked, almost innocently, "How are things with Amy? She's unpredictable sometimes, isn't she? That's part of her charm." Mark, ever the confident one, laughed it off. But I could see a flicker of something in his eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps. The seed had been planted. After that, I made it a point to show up more often where I knew they'd be. I never approached Amy directly, but I always made sure to exchange a few words with Mark. A little comment here, a subtle suggestion there. Enough to make him question the small things like why Amy was late or why she seemed distracted after their fights. I was careful though. Too obvious and Mark would suspect me. Too vague and it wouldn't take root. The balance had to be perfect. At the same time, I began working on Amy. She was easier to reach emotionally, especially now that she was already doubting her decision to leave me. I knew exactly what to say, exactly how to remind her of the life we'd shared, without directly confronting her about Mark. When we ran into each other at events, I kept my distance, letting her come to me. She always did, eventually. "Amy," I'd say, keeping my tone light as though we were old friends. "Remember when we used to go to that little cafe? You always said they made the best cappuccino. Funny how the small things stick with you, isn't it?" She'd smile, but there was always something behind it, a flicker of doubt, perhaps. It didn't take much to bring back memories of the life we had, the stability I'd offered her. I didn't need to make her regret leaving me. She was already doing that on her own. The tension between them grew. Their arguments became more frequent, more heated. Mark grew suspicious and Amy grew defensive. I didn't need to be there to see it, I could feel it in every interaction we had. She was unraveling, and Mark's ego wouldn't let him see that he was the cause of it. I played them both perfectly, always one step ahead. Neither of them suspected that I was behind it all. But that was the beauty of it. While they tore each other apart, I simply watched, waiting for the moment to strike. And that moment was coming soon. By the time I saw them again, the cracks had become impossible to ignore. It was at a dinner party hosted by one of our mutual friends. I arrived late on purpose, giving myself a moment to watch them from a distance before making my entrance. Amy looked tired, exhausted really. Her usual effortless grace was missing, replaced by a strained expression that told me she hadn't slept well in days. Mark, on the other hand, was trying too hard. His smile was forced, his laughter too loud, as if he were compensating for the fact that his world was slowly crumbling. I knew that look. It was the same look I'd had when I first realized Amy was seeing someone else. Throughout the night, I stayed on the periphery, observing their interactions. They barely spoke to each other, and when they did, it was tense, filled with unspoken accusations. Mark was growing more suspicious, more paranoid. He hadn't figured it out yet, but he was close. Amy, on the other hand, seemed lost, caught between guilt and regret. The weight of her choices was starting to crush her, and it showed in every movement, every glance. At one point, I found myself alone with Amy by the bar. She was nursing a glass of wine, her fingers tracing the rim absent-mindedly. I could tell she was struggling, trying to hold it together in front of everyone. "How are you, Amy?" I asked softly, leaning against the bar beside her. My tone was casual, but I knew my presence would stir something in her. It always did. She hesitated, then glanced up at me, her eyes weary. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. I smiled gently, as if I hadn't noticed the tension between her and Mark. "You seem distant." There was a long pause before she answered, her eyes flicking briefly to where Mark stood across the room. "Things aren't as easy as I thought they'd be," she admitted quietly, her voice heavy with unspoken regret. I nodded, pretending to understand. Sometimes, the hardest decisions leave us wondering if we made the right choice. She didn't respond, but I could see the doubt in her eyes, the way she twisted the ring on her finger, a nervous habit I knew all too well. She was starting to question everything. The life she had built with Mark, the decision to leave me. All of it. By the end of the night, it was clear that whatever they once had was hanging by a thread. Mark barely acknowledged Amy as they left, his hand brushing hers only out of obligation, not affection. She too looked lost, like she was searching for something that wasn't there. They were falling apart just as I'd planned. And I didn't even need to lift a finger. They were doing it to themselves. It wasn't long after that night at the dinner party that I received the message from Amy. She wanted to meet, to talk, as she put it. I wasn't surprised. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I knew she was at her breaking point, and I was more than ready to take advantage of it. We met at a small cafe, one of our old haunts. She was already sitting at a corner table when I arrived, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. She looked up when I walked in, and for a moment, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. But that moment passed quickly. "Christian," she began softly as I sat down across from her. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About us. About everything." I didn't say anything at first, letting her speak, letting her work through the guilt that was clearly eating away at her. "I made a mistake," she admitted, her voice shaky. "Leaving you, it wasn't the right choice. I thought Mark was what I wanted, but he's not. He's not you." There it was. The moment of regret I'd been waiting for. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my expression neutral. "What are you saying, Amy?" She looked down at her hands, twisting her fingers nervously. "I don't know," she whispered. Maybe we could try again. Start over." For a split second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered everything. The lies, the betrayal, the way she had so easily discarded me for someone else. Any sympathy I might have felt vanished. "No, Amy," I said quietly, my voice cold. "We can't start over." She looked up at me, confused, her eyes searching mine for some sign of hope. "But I thought." "You thought wrong," I interrupted, my tone sharper now. "You see, I know about Mark. I've known for a long time." Her face went pale, her eyes widening in shock. "What? How?" I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I've known everything, Amy. From the very beginning. I let you think you were in control, that you were the one calling the shots. But the truth is, I've been playing you both from the start." She stared at me, her mouth slightly open in disbelief. "Christian, what are you talking about? Every doubt you've had, every fight you've had with Mark, it wasn't by accident. I made sure of it. I planted the seeds, and you two did the rest." Tears welled up in her eyes as the realization sank in. She had been outplayed in every way. And now there was nothing left for her to hold on to. "Christian," she whispered, her voice breaking. I stood up, looking down at her with a calmness I hadn't felt in a long time. "Goodbye, Amy." And with that, I walked out of the cafe, leaving her to face the consequences of her choices. As I walked away from the cafe, a strange sense of peace settled over me. It wasn't triumph, not the kind that people expect when they think of revenge. It was quieter, more subdued. But it was satisfying all the same. Amy would live with the weight of her choices, haunted by the knowledge that she had been outsmarted at every turn. Mark, too, would eventually leave her, unable to shake the doubts that had been planted. They would both suffer, not through some grand dramatic act of revenge, but through the slow, painful realization that their lives were unraveling by their own hands. That was enough for me. I didn't need to stick around to see it happen. I didn't need to gloat or revel in their misery. I had gotten what I wanted, a sense of closure, of control. The part of me that had loved Amy was long gone, buried under layers of betrayal and hurt. What was left was something stronger, something more resilient. I had rebuilt myself, and now I was free. As I walked down the street, the cool evening air brushing against my skin, I felt lighter than I had in months. The weight of the past was gone, and with it, the anger that had driven me for so long. Amy would carry her regrets, but I wouldn't. I had let go of mine. And that, in the end, was the real victory. Thanks for tuning in. If you loved this emotional story and want more captivating ones with unexpected twists, be sure to hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story drops. Don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts about the story in the comments below. We can't wait to hear what you think. See you in the next story.